Hey, hello everyone and welcome to June's webinar. My name is Liz Mann. I'm the project coordinator from Asia Innovation, employed by Dairy Australia, but working for the Victorian Dairy Innovation Agreement, or the VDIA. So the VDIA is a joint venture partnership between Dairy Australia, the Gardner Foundation and Agriculture Victoria that oversees the majority of dairy research projects, or the major dairy research projects of DairyBio and Dairy Feedbase. So this month, we are joined by DataGene's Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Matt Shaffer. Matt has been working in agriculture in Australia for 20 plus years. You will notice he does have a bit of an accent, so he has got a history elsewhere. So Matt's currently working as the CEO of DataGene, and we're heading straight to the top for answers around what's been happening within herd genetics for the past 40 years. So thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thanks, Liz. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I will say it's a bit strange only seeing you. So it's you and I talking, and there's a crew listening. So yeah, hopefully it goes okay.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be fine. We will be fine. Now,
people can understand my accent.
Oh, they will be fine. All right. Now, neither of us are going to admit to which side we're on here, but depending on your age, 40 years ago is either a short time or a long time ago. You've spent a bit of time in the last little bit looking back, and this webinar has probably come out of your presentation to Herd 23, where you talked about what happened. As you've looked back and considered the changes that have occurred in that time, which I know you weren't here for all of it, what has stood out as one of the biggest changes that has occurred in your mind?
I might take the liberty of saying there's probably two.
Okay, you can have two.
One is quite simply just technology. You know, if you think back to 1983, which I am old enough to well remember that, and the songs that were about at that time, including Total Eclipse of the Heart. But in any case, if we think about the technology, we have so far advanced. Early in those years, it would take us 3 months to run genetic evaluation. We now do it in 3 days. Early on, we did one run a year, and then moved to 3, and then more. Now we do 43 runs a year. And so the scale of that is massive. We used to run it on the Department of Treasury computers, and then the computers that ran the traffic light system in Melbourne. We now have our own systems that run all of this. So that technology side has been quite important. But on the actual genetic side, I think the biggest change has been a shift from looking purely at one group of traits. We started with production, yield, fat and protein, and we've now moved to 45 plus traits and indices that balance traits. So we've moved away from chasing a single thing and moved to this multi-trait approach, where I think we do a much better job of understanding the interconnectedness of our animals and how they interact with the environment and how that all hangs together. So for a long time, we focused on production, and that was the only trait we were chasing. We put type in as well, but where we ended up was production is in opposition to fertility, and so we've had a situation in particularly in the Holstein breed where the fertility suffered for quite a few years as we chased production, but we've turned that around, and that was through a lot of hard work by the entire industry focusing on fertility as an issue. And pleased to say that we're starting to see that come back and starting to see fertility improve, certainly at a genetic level, but also on farms we're starting to see some improvement there. So it goes to show, when we set our minds to it, how we can actually make improvements in genetics.
And that is quite interesting, that shift from single focus, because it was such a thing, and I did start 20 years ago in the industry, and fertility was such a worry and such a concern. How long has it taken to swing that back the other way? Like, how long have we been changed from that single focus to that more balanced approach?
Well, we started in the early 2000s, so we're talking 20 years.
Yeah.
Genetics is a long game. It's not something that you expect to to see a change in the next year. It's something that you don't really see a change in your herd until the next generation come into the dairy. So it is a long game, but you can make progress, and we can see that progress. But I think that's the important thing about genetics. It's long term, but it also compounds. So you just continually get better, which is the important thing to keep in mind as well.
You said genetically we're starting to see that turnaround in fertility. We are starting to see that on farm, are we?
Yeah, so the latest work that John Morton has done is starting to show that happening at a farm level as well. There's generally a lag between the genetic indication and then the on-farm indications, but that's coming through.
Yeah, that's great.
It's fantastic. And I'll just say, given that this is a DairyBio type focus, a lot of that came about because of some of the fantastic science coming out of not only DairyBio, but before that, the Dairy Futures CRC around around fertility. And that's been quite an important component of being able to chase that and then take that into the farmer, out to the farmers through the service providers, the bull companies. And so it's just been quite a massive push from everyone, I think.
And it's probably good you've mentioned there, DairyBio. What is the connection then between DataGene and DairyBio? Because that is part of what we are about to explore here, is that connection.
Sure.
What is it?
So we have a very, very close connection with DairyBio. We work with the scientists there on a daily basis. And if I describe it in a few words, DairyBio performs the core research. We then work to translate that research into the paddock and bring that out to farmers and service providers. So the work that DairyBio does around, say, improving the fertility breeding value, that gets implemented by DataGene, and then we work to bring that out to the paddock. So we work across the board with them from inception of projects through to delivery. So we have got a very close connect with them, and that's been the case for some time now. And I think it's been quite successful and been a real strong point for the Australian industry that's recognized globally as we work so well together with our research base.
That's great. And one of the things we are talking about here is the improvement in genetic gain, which has occurred because of that connection. How do we compare when we look at the genetic gain that's happening within the Australian dairy herd? Is it good? Is it bad? Are we leaping ahead, or are we lagging a bit behind? Where do we fit?
So at the herd conference and a few other times, I tend to use a slide that shows genetic graph and genetic progress. And through the 1980s and 90s, there's a slow improvement. There's a tremendous jump in genetic gain around the introduction of genomic technology. And we can talk a bit more about that as you like. And in the last 10 years, I would say we've really started to accelerate the rate of genetic gain. And there was recently a study done internationally comparing, I forget how many countries, 8 or 9 of the bigger dairy countries around the world. And in the period 2000-2005, we were about half of the average rate of genetic gain internationally. In the last 5 years, we are now above the average rate. So we've really increased our rate of genetic gain, which has been, as I said earlier, due to the work that the whole industry does together.
So what do you reckon is the one key driver of us being able to, and I have seen the graph, it sort of goes and then ramps. Yeah. What is that driver? Like, what is the turning point for where we start to really take off?
The introduction of genomics is really the turning point for that. And again, that came from a predecessor of DairyBio. There are lots of steps along the journey, and we focus a lot on making sure that the technology gets used and how it gets taken up and how we can improve it. But the primary turning point was introduction of genomics.
That's amazing. And so going forward, what's going to be driving our continued improvement in genetic gain?
I think there's a range of things. We're always looking to improve what we currently do. Fertility is still an issue for us, so we're still working on that. I think the big area that's coming and is here really is around sustainability. And I use that word in a broad sense. Uh, Typically, we think of sustainability as but in the dairy industry potentially as a methane question, which it to a large degree is. But I mean that more broadly, and I mean that around health, survival, how many times you treat your cow with various drugs, etc. So all of that, I think, is part of sustainability, as well as the ability of the farm to make a profit and stay in business, which is if that doesn't work, none of it matters. So
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, when I say sustainability in that more fulsome context. And for me, the big trait coming is methane, a real breeding value to based on methane work. We introduced about 12 months ago a sustainability index, which will help farmers to breed cows that have reduced methane intensity, and that's very important. We will try to improve this index over the next few years by getting an actual methane breeding value as well, and adding in other things. But the first step was really getting an index that farmers could use that will enable them to enable them to breed for reduced methane intensity.
Yep. So you're talking there about breeding values and indexes. What's the difference? Just so
Good question, and pull me up on this. I sort of inhabit this world, so I get lost in all the acronyms and everything else. So please pull me up. And again, I'm not a scientist, and I play one poorly on television. But my view is a trait, a breeding value, is a single thing. So it's milk, or it's protein, or it's fat, or its fertility, where an index is a combination of multiple traits that tries to balance out how that all interacts and tries to make sure that we don't end up where we were in the past by focusing on a trait and having all the negative consequences of that. We know a lot more about the negative consequences now. So within an index environment, we try to protect against some of those negative impacts. So that's really the difference in my view between an index and a breeding value. An index is more balanced. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't then say, okay, well, out of that index, I want to breed a more fertile cow. You can absolutely do that. But it is also a better way of making sure we don't inadvertently create problems.
We've been there, done that, I feel. So when it comes to developing those breeding values, what is going on in the background? What's happening with the researchers? How are they then bringing the information to you at DataGene? What happens?
That's a good question, and I could probably rabbit on for quite some time about it, because that's the the area we focus on. But if I think about some of the main steps that are of interest to people, it starts with data, and most of that data comes directly from farmers. So the farmers work and they collect data on their farms. We then pull that together. The researchers use that data to research a new trait. So for instance, heat tolerance that came out of DairyBio a few years ago. That was based on data that farmers had collected on their farms. And then the researchers took that data and married it with other pieces of information, such as weather and some observations down at Ellenbank, and created a breeding value out of that. And then we take that, implement it into our systems, where then we enable any cow in Australia to be tested for that. So you can get a breeding value for any cow or any bull.
That's pretty cool.
But that's in a very short way. There's lots of stuff in there, but that's my 10-second view.
Yeah, we only have, certain amount of time. So with those breeding values, that data, how do you know it's reliable? How do you know you're getting good data in? How do you know the breeding value you're coming out with is a reliable one?
Sure. Great question. And there are a couple things to it. One, we continually check our breeding values, and we go back in time and say, if we had made a breeding value 4 years ago, how would the descendants of those animals perform today based on our knowledge? And so we continually check that that's still working. We also go through tests with Interpol, which look at very similar things to just to make sure we're as accurate as we can be. More broadly, you asked a question about how do we know the data is accurate. We work very closely with a fantastic group of farmers that we call GINFO. And again, that came out of predecessors of DairyBio. And that group of farmers are fantastic data collectors, and we work quite closely with them to make sure we get a good stream of really high quality data coming in, so that that's what we use for core research, and that's what the science team use as well. We also work with them to chase different phenotypes that may not be, so by phenotypes, I mean observations of a cow. So a phenotype, for instance, could be how tall the cow is or how much milk she produces. So it's an observation about that cow. But phenotype is shorter than observations of that cow.
Yeah,
So,
a lot shorter.
a lot shorter. So we work with those farmers to get very specific things that the team at DairyBio want to know. So for instance, that group, GINFO farmers, we worked with them to get blood samples and milk recording from them when we started working with mid-infrared technology, and worked very closely with the group. And that was again a big industry effort to enable us to marry up all the different things we already know about a cow with what was happening within her blood and what was happening within the milk. And that was really a fantastic project. And that's now led to the introduction of what we call the mere conception report. And that enables farmers from a single herd test to be able to predict whether a cow will become pregnant through the first insemination or not. And it uses a whole range of factors. And so I think that's been a really good indication of how we work together with the data and the science and then implementation to make that come to fruition over a few years. None of this happens overnight, unfortunately. So it does take some time, but I think that's been a good effort on the industry's behalf.
And it's good that you mentioned the mid-infrared conception stuff, because in February, I actually spoke with Fong Ho and Joe Newton, who did all that work in the background, and we recorded the webinar. So it is sitting there in the recordings. And it was quite interesting just to see how all that worked and, you know, the data that goes into it, but then how it can be used on farm and how we can work out which are our more fertile cows from a simple herd test,
Yep,
which is,
right.
you know, farmers are doing that. So that's quite amazing. You've mentioned GINFO herd, and I think I just want to delve down there just a little bit. How many herds are we talking about here?
So we currently have about 160, give or take. We started out earlier on with less than 100, and we've expanded over the years. And that's probably about where we want to sit, about 60,000 cows, give or take. And those farms come from around Australia, so every dairying area is represented. We have a variety of breeds, reflective of the split within the industry. And that was a recent addition. We started out focusing on Holstein and then moved into Jerseys and Reds and Ayrshires and Guernseys. And so we're just trying to expand that and work closely with those farmers.
Yeah. How do you go finding the smaller, like your Reds and your Guernseys? Brown Swiss, got any Brown Swiss in there?
Yes, because there are lots of, I shouldn't say lots, there are farms with multiple breeds. And from our point of view, we want to enable farmers to work with whatever cows they want to work with and give them the best information we can. So we work very closely with the breed societies, and through work that DairyBio has done over the last few years, we introduced genomic breeding values for the Aussie Red breed as well as Ayrshires and Illawarras. So again, that was a long-term project working with the farmers themselves, the scientists, and DataGene to come up with these breeding values. And really pleased to say we'll be moving to weekly releases of those in the not too distant future. So it's been a challenge because they're smaller breeds, so we had to do some fancy footwork to find methodology that helped. And the team at DairyBio was fantastic to work with, as well as our own science team to make that happen. So that's been that was a good move, and the breed societies have worked with us side by side to make sure we can offer this to their members.
So when we're looking at our breeding values, they've obviously changed over time. You've mentioned the sustainability index and the methane breeding value. Any other breeding values that might be coming down the pipeline or are being researched at the minute that may influence going forward?
Sure. And I mentioned when I said sustainability, and I was quite broad about that. So I think within that space, there are a couple, and people like Dr. Jenny Price, Professor Jenny Price, I should say, would be better to talk to about the specifics of those. But from my knowledge, what we're really trying to focus on is around resilience, longevity, calf vitality, for instance. So there's a great project on the run at the moment, and some really good work coming out of that. And again, that calf vitality project is a great example of how we work with farmers directly to get the information the scientists need to then help. So I think that will come in the next probably 12 to 24 months. And transition cow work is important. How does a cow transition from dry to calving and into dairy? And general health resilience is probably where the big ticket items, I would say.
With things like particularly a transition cow, but even a little bit to do with calf vitality, doesn't management have a role to play there? Like, how much does the genes and the genetics affect the outcome compared to management in those cases?
Great question, Liz. And it varies by trait. So some traits have a higher component of genetics and some traits have a lower. And I won't go into the scientific detail because I'll probably muck it up and confuse myself. But it does depend. But what genetics does when we look at it, what the methodology that we use does is it says, well, we only compare cows within a herd, within a year, and within a season. So we're only ever comparing those cows together to come up with the breeding values. So that holds that management constant from that point of view. You're not necessarily comparing the performance of one cow in this herd with a cow performance in the other to come up with the breeding values.
Okay, right. So essentially what you're doing is attempting to just isolate what is the genetic
component
influence on that trait, rather than management.
Yeah. And management plays a massive part in something, for instance, like fertility we were talking about earlier. It's mainly management, but that's not to say we can't make, and we have made genetic progress on that, but they go hand in hand. Genetics is never the only answer. It's always part of an answer.
Yeah. Does the research take into account the management at all when it's looking at?
And again, I think I would preface my response by saying I'm not a geneticist. And Jenny would answer this differently. Hart would answer this differently. Tui would answer it differently. The way I would answer is yes, we do. We try to take that into account. We work and try to separate the two. We acknowledge that we call them heritabilities and whether they're extremely heritable or not. And we do a good job, as do all the other genetic evaluation units around the world of trying to deliver as reliable breeding values as we can. And that's been a long-term journey to do that. And again, I'll hook it back to Jinfo to say that we've managed to double the reliability effectively of cow breeding values by using Jinfo.
And that's fascinating that you've doubled the reliability using that herd. Well, the researchers using the data from that herd. Before we sort of throw over to questions, we'll be heading to questions, and there's a couple sitting there in the next few minutes. So just a reminder for everyone, pop your questions in. Dairy beef. I think I've seen
sustainability trait. Yep.
Yeah, I've seen somewhere that there's something happening. What's going on? Because it's starting to become, a focus more within our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree with that. And I think it's coming into focus for a range of reasons. One is the uptake of sex semen and therefore the production of more heifers. And then you probably potentially have more heifers than you need. So that's one. And the focus on the non-dairy replacement animals that come on and what we do with those. So I think that's all tied together. Globally, this is an issue. It's not just an Australian issue. This is true everywhere. So globally, there's been a focus on, well, how do we make sure that when we use beef on dairy, that it does what we want it to do in terms of calving ease, because that's a big trait from a dairy farmer point of view, easy calving, but also that we produce an animal that at the other end of the supply chain, at the beef end, actually meets customer expectations as well. So there's a lot of work being done, and we're doing some here. We've just finished a project with Joe Newton. She did a fantastic job of looking at what's happening around the world. So that might be something we can talk about in the future. But there will be more emphasis on this to make sure that we can provide some help to farmers as they look to use beef semen.
So will the focus be from the beef side or the dairy side when you start to get into that index, or can't you answer that question at this point, Matt?
Well, we know a lot about the dairy side. At this stage, we probably don't know a lot about the beef side. So the beef industry does a lot of fantastic work on the genetic space as well, and it's the interaction of those two that we're looking at the moment. So it's a combination of the beef genetics on top of the dairy genetics.
Yeah. And so will you be working with the beef industry to get this up and running?
Yeah, I think that's going to be an important focus for the next few years.
Yeah. DataGene and DairyBio are all a collaborative effort. How does all that work with service providers and all that sort of stuff? How does the collaboration work?
With a lot of hard work. And I have to say, I think we've got an amazing herd improvement industry in Australia, because it takes all players in this to make it work. So it takes the science to work, it takes us to implement it that works, it takes the service providers who go on farm and talk about it, it takes the RDPs who then talk to the farmers as well to make sure it's all in line, and it takes farmers actually making decisions using the tools to work. So we spend a lot of time talking to all of those groups to make sure that we meet expectations of what they want us to do, what areas they're concerned about, and how do we improve what we offer them. And I think that's the key, is that we have open conversation with them on an ongoing basis. And everybody talks about collaboration, but it's hard work, and it should be. But I think the payoff is quite dramatic.
And I think that's the interesting thing, is that we are, as an industry, quite willing to be collaborative. And I suppose going forward, that collaboration has shaped what DairyBio looks like currently, and then what you are getting and what you are putting out at DataGene, making it as relevant as we can for farmers, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. And DataGene is about to embark on a strategic planning and thinking about where the next 5 years are going. And that'll include discussions with farmers and industry and service providers and members of DataGene, et cetera. Because I think it's important to take all of that into account and try to come up with something that meets as many needs as we can, because we're all in the same boat. And particularly around the sustainability issue, I think we're really all in the same boat.
Yeah, and sustainability will be one going forward that is going to be tricky, because it's not an easy genomic fix, I suppose. But yeah, that will be quite interesting. Yeah, and you're right, the long term genetics plays a slow, I say that with inverted commas, because it's taken us 20 years to fix fertility. It's going to take a long time to improve methane and all those other traits that have a lot of management around them as well.
Agreed. And like I said earlier, I think genetics is never the answer. It's always part of an answer. And while it may be slow, I think the important thing to remember is that it is cumulative. So you just keep building on it. And the other thing is that you do this every year. You make a decision as a farmer every year what genetics you're going to use, and you might as well use stuff that makes it better over the journey. So it's just about making a slightly different decision, I think.
Yeah, Yeah, exactly. Right. We might start on some audience questions, and there's already some
Sure.
sitting there, Matt.
Sure.
So we might start. There's a question there about how does the industry improve data accessibility and not going to be able to say this word, synchronicity, between different herd health recording systems to improve opportunities for accurate benchmarking and reporting through DataVat or DataGene.
So that's a big topic, and I'll try to answer it in potentially a couple of different ways. One is, I think that's one of the big areas of focus for DataGene over the next few years is how do we improve the data connectivity between the different groups, not just for the genetics of it. In my view, genetics is a byproduct of data. It should be able to help farmers. So what we're focusing on at the moment is what are we hearing from farmers, and what we hear from farmers is that, don't make me enter things twice. We want to enter it once and have it move between systems. So we're trying to work with the big international equipment manufacturers like DairyBio and GIA, et cetera, and say, well, how do we move data more efficiently? And that is part of the answer. Another part of the answer is how do we work with local software manufacturers like Easy Dairy or equipment manufacturers like Jantech. How do we start to move that data around? And those are big, sticky questions, and they're questions that globally are relevant and active. So unfortunately, there's no silver bullet in there that we can say, well, tomorrow we're going to turn everything on and it'll be perfect. But it is definitely a focus for us at the moment to say, well, how do we start making better progress on it? Because it's my one regret as CEO of DataGene that we haven't made more progress. So I think that's where you have a fantastic question, and we just need to keep chipping away at it. And that saying, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? We need the first bites.
At that synchronizing of data, entering data once, that solving that issue, I feel would make farmers feel an awful lot better about the world, because it's not just within the herd recording genetic space, it's everywhere. You're entering data twice, or it's entered over here, but to get it from here to here,
I would agree, and that's what we hear. And we need to look and say, okay, well, we can't fix everything overnight. Where do we focus? What are we looking at? And I think one thing we can't lose sight of, and this is where I think, again, DairyBio comes back into it. If we start to put together different data sources that historically we haven't been able to put together, what can we do with that to give farmers better decision-making tools? And that's the real promise of this, I think, in the long term. So you've got the management purpose of making farmers' lives easier because they don't have to enter data multiple times, et cetera. But what we should be able to do is to turn that into meaningful insights back to them to help them improve the decisions.
Yeah.
And both those things, I think, are equally important.
Yeah. Yes. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you. I've been working at it for a while.
Oh yeah, I feel like it'll be. What was that? What were you saying before? It takes a long time to, Yeah. Okay, so another question: how do you effectively use the profit index? Do you make, for example, an extra $200 per year if you have a $200 profit index?
Yeah. So my view of these things is that an index is a decision-making tool. So we would always say, choose a good bull and look at where it fits and make the decisions based on what your breeding goals are, what you want to focus on. Is it fertility, for instance? Is it protein, for instance? Is it fat? And choose from that bull list. The dollar values are profit figures within the Balanced Performance Index, which is an economic index, so that the dollar value does relate to a dollar value directly. But the way you use it is really about just picking bulls that are higher up the tree than at the bottom. But within that range, there's a bull for everybody, I would say, and just pick one from the good bulls list.
Yep. Yes, that a bull for everyone. I love that line. Bull for everyone.
That's our job, is to enable farmers to make decisions. So we can help that. We don't want to dictate it all.
No. Well, and that's true. Like, not we're all different. We all have different farming systems. So one bull that suits one farm is not going to suit the other. So you can't dictate that bull X is the one that everyone should use, because that also then gets us into a whole other world of genetic problems.
Absolutely.
As
Yeah,
well.
I agree. We just want to be able to find the best bulls from around the world to make farmers in Australia able to make the decisions they need.
Yeah.
That's sort of what we're after.
Yeah. Yeah. So what data have you collected to make the decision that there is, let me start that again, Mark. What data have you collected to make the decision that there is a need for a sustainability index? That's a really good question.
It is a good question, and there's a couple different components to it. One is we were asked by farmers, how do we start to make a difference? So that's a data point. We're being asked by industry about it as well. What's happening with this? Globally, there is a push, and I would say it's the only game in town at an international level, is trying to be able to demonstrate that we are contributing to reducing methane effects, and all the other associated work around there. In terms of specific data, I think the big ticket item was methane collection down at Ellenbank. So there was, can't remember the exact figure, between 400 and 500 cows, I think, that were put through the system down at Ellenbank, and actual methane was measured, and that enabled us to use those figures to then produce an index that helped reduce that intensity. So in other words, you produce less methane for the same amount of production. So we use that as the key.
This is the bit, and I find this quite fascinating. You think a cow's a cow, right? And we've put a lot of time into breeding these cows. Their methane emission is very different between each cow, isn't it? Like, we're not talking that, every cow will emit, so many, how do they measure it? Kilograms or, whatever of methane. Each cow is different. And that's driven by genetics, is it?
So
driven by management and gut bacteria.
Like everything, it's both, all three, if you include gut bacteria. So what we can help affect is the genetic side of that, to say we know genetically that there is an impact, and certain genetics mean that the cows produce less methane per unit of milk. And this is, again, I come back to my comment earlier, genetics is never the answer, it's always part of the answer. So I think there's a range of things that farmers will consider around how do we reduce our footprint, whether that's genetics, because I think that's long-term and cumulative, so that's an important component of that, but there may be management tools that they can use, and a whole range of things. We can't, as geneticists, actually control all of those. We focus on the genetic side, but it's important that we look at it as a toolbox, and what's a toolbox that farmers can use to make decisions they want to make.
And it's because the beef industry, I think I read, or I saw the headline somewhere the other day, that the beef industry have actually managed to reduce their carbon footprint. I think they've got the target of 0, but they have managed to significantly reduce it. So we can do it. We can get there.
And the dairy industry, by breeding the way we have, we've also reduced methane intensity quite significantly already. So I think absolutely we can do it. We just have to keep at it.
Yeah, won't happen overnight. Isn't that an old shampoo ad? So
showing our age, Liz.
Is feed conversion efficiency linked to their methane production? Do you know the answer to that one, Matt?
Yes and yes.
Good.
So look, a lot of these traits are not independent. They are correlated. They move in certain ways. Some of them are positively correlated. So for instance, the stature of a cow is linked positively to their production. They're also correlated negatively. So for instance, fertility is negatively correlated with fertility. So if your production goes up, you're generally speaking, your fertility goes down. So the beauty of the science and the methodology is it takes all of that into account when we do the indices. And so feed conversion efficiency is a component of methane. It's linked to it. It's a correlated trait, but it's not the only thing. So I think, again, I want us to be really careful that we don't focus only on methane or only on feed conversion efficiency, because I think it's all quite importantly that we understand how they interact together.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so I have one final question that I don't think either you or I can answer, but I'm going to put it out there. What happens to DairyBio after 2026, Matt?
Oh, you're going to chuck that one to me, are you, Liz?
Yeah, great. Yep, I am.
Right.
Because
So
I can't answer that one. Not even going to pretend that I can.
the Matt Shaffer view of the world says that we need to continue this long-term investment in an important area for the dairy industry. And I've said a couple of times, and you've mentioned, these are long-term, large-scale projects. And so we need to make sure that we have some continuation so we can continue to deliver products that allow farmers to breed the cows for the future. So what that looks like, I don't know, but I think we need to work together to make sure we continue to do what we set out to do, which is to breed better cows. Yeah.
And I think we have managed to improve greatly in the last 40 years. Like you and I in our conversation, we've wandered all over the place today. But I suppose the main theme is that sound research has helped our dairy herd to improve greatly in the last 40 years. And I can't believe it was 1983, that is 40 years ago. That's just terrifying. And that improvement has seen us get to where we are today. And it's so important that we continue to improve. We can't just go, yep, done 40 years, great. I'm going to sit back and do nothing.
Absolutely agree. And I think it's that continual focus and the continual renewal that it will enable this to continue in the future and keep breeding better and better cows. We're always learning. We're always finding new things. And we really want to make sure that as an industry, we can help make our farmers make easier decisions and better ones.
Yeah, exactly. We might wrap it up at that, Matt. I reckon there's no more questions there. We even tackled that tricky one. I think.
Not very well, but anyway.
Unfortunately, we don't hold the purse strings. It has been fantastic chatting with you, and I really do appreciate your time. For anyone who is on this webinar that would like more information about DairyBio or DataGene or any of the projects that are mentioned throughout this webinar, I'll send out a follow-up email, and I'll have in there the links to the DairyBio website and the DataGene websites, so you can go and check those out. This is our third webinar for the year, and I'm only doing them every second month, so that means we are halfway through the year. The two previous webinars were recorded, and they're available on the Dairy Australia YouTube channel under the innovation section. And this webinar will be available. We'll tidy up back end and front end, and we'll put this webinar out with the follow-up email that I send. Our next webinar will be in August, and we're hoping to talk to someone out of the new Dairy Feed Base project. So Dairy Feed Base finishes officially tomorrow and starts anew on the 1st of July. But that new project, which will run from 2023 to 2028, is got some really fascinating little bits in it. So hoping to talk to someone out of that and talk about what they're going to be looking at and what we're hoping to see at the end. As we wrap up, I should note that DairyBio and Dairy Feed Base are programs that are a joint venture agreement between Dairy Australia, Agriculture Victoria and the Gardner Foundation. And DataGene is also an industry initiative funded by Dairy Australia and the herd improvement industry. So thanks again, Matt. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been great. And we look forward to seeing you all again in August.
Great.
Thanks
very much for having me, Liz.